Got it. Okay. Okay. Yes. Welcome, everybody. My name's Susan Hurst, as you can see from there. I'm the president of the Field Gnats, Midland-Penetanguishene Field Gnats Club. And on this lovely summer's evening, we're going to have a presentation from James Kamstra, who's going to be telling us about the Ontario butterfly count, which apparently has been going for, I believe it's 25 years. And I've actually just signed up for it this week, so I haven't been able to do it the last few years, but I really enjoyed the couple of times I did it. So it's a great day and a good way to learn about butterflies, and I'm looking forward to the presentation. Anything else, Ken, at this point to tell people?
No, I think that's good, Susan. I'm going to spotlight myself.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Ken then for the introduction.
And let me just find James here. Okay, so welcome everybody and welcome James. I'll introduce him just in just a minute, but I just want to add one more thing before we start. You see in my screen behind me an email address, treasurer@mpfn.xyz. And when we have our live meetings, we usually encourage people who aren't a member of the club to make a small contribution to help us with overhead costs, $5 or something like that. And it's a little more difficult to do that during COVID times, but not impossible. If anybody feels inspired at the end of the talk to make a small contribution, you can make an e-transfer to that email address, treasurer@mpfn.xyz. So that's the only commercial we have tonight. But although we will be advertising the Awenda butterfly count, which is coming up on, I think, July 9th, but we'll talk more about that later. So just a little introduction of James Kamstra. James is a respected field ecologist with a broad interest in natural history, particularly in fields of botany, birds, reptiles, and insects. He comes to us, he grew up on the outskirts of Oshawa, where he started his interest in nature as a young pup of about 10 years old. He was collecting insects at that time. He presently works as a senior ecologist, environmental consultant for engineering firm, how do you say that, James? AECOM? AECOM. He conducts biological inventories and environmental impact studies of development impacts on flora and fauna. He's the Ontario Regional Editor for the North American Butterfly Association and the Toronto Entomological Association, a regional director and board member of Ontario Nature. He's the current president of North Durham Nature, which is a naturalist club just like ours, and a former member of the Governmental Committee on the Status of Species at Risk in Ontario, which is responsible for designating the provincial list of endangered species. James has traveled widely and led ecotour groups to many international destinations, including Belize, Brazil, Costa Rica, Cuba, Galapagos, Guyana, and Peru. And you're still on your way to Colombia this winter, or did that already happen?
No, I'm we have a trip planned this winter. I was scouting it out last winter. Beautiful place, amazing for birds and animals.
Well, I'm going to unpin myself, James, and then turn it over to you to share your screen. Okay, we've got your screen, and if you go full screen now, there we go, looks good.
Okay, full screen. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. My pleasure to be here. This was a program I put together a couple of years ago. And so, in fact, at the time, it was 25 years. And now it's been a few years, over 25 years. Ontario butterfly counts have been actually going on for a little bit longer than that, but I've been doing, in fact, it's getting close to 30 years for the first count that I started doing. My, as Ken mentioned, my interest in natural history goes back a long ways. When I was 12 years old, I was already collecting insects. And in fact, kind of a funny story, I became quite obsessed with collecting not just butterflies, but moths and all kinds of other insects. And my father was kind of worried I was getting too obsessed about it. So he actually banned me from collecting insects for a whole week, which when I was about 11, 12 years old, that seemed like a long time. But I remember at the very end of the week, we were at this picnic and I wandered away from the rest of the picnic and I saw this cicada up in the tree. It was the first cicada I ever saw. So I climbed up the tree, I caught the cicada in my hand and I came running back with the cicada buzzing in my hand. And I said to my dad, the week's over. And so I never had to do that again. So anyway, I have been fascinated with butterflies for the long time. And in 1992, some friends of mine who were in the Long Point area, they told me about this butterfly count going on, and I'd never heard of them before, but I thought, sure, I'll come over and see what it's all about. So we broke up in groups and wandered through fields, counting every butterfly that we saw. And at the end, we had a big tally and people got together and shared the results. And that was the first I'd ever heard of them. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. Maybe I'll start one in my own area. So I'm in Durham, north of Oshawa. So I looked to see what would be a good area to do it. We have the Oak Ridges Moraine, which has quite a bit of habitat. So I came up with this circle between Port Perry and Oshawa and advertised, see who I could entice into helping me cover this area, because it's a pretty big area. The counts there are 15 miles in diameter or 24 kilometers. So pretty darn big area. So I did round up a bunch of people. This was not actually the first count, but it was one of the first counts. We had a barbecue at our house afterwards and tallied the results. I even had my kids out at the time. And so that became like an institution. Some of the people have been on every count since then, and other people have kind of come and gone, but it certainly has inspired a lot of people. Some other people have gone on to start their own counts from that. Now, in the northern part of Durham, I was in an area around Sunderland, and I saw these Baltimore checker spots, beautiful butterfly. You probably have them in your area. We don't have them in the southern part of Durham at all, but they were quite common along this rail trail. And so that kind of inspired me to set up a second count in Durham region. At first, I had a buddy who lived up there and I thought maybe I could talk him into compiling it, which didn't work. So I ended up compiling the two counts. So here is the circle of that one. It's partly within York region, partly with Durham, and it centered on this rail trail, which goes to the Beaver River wetland. And there was just all this great habitat on there. Now, the butterfly counts, they were initially started by the Xerces Society, which is a lepidopterist group in the US, and they borrowed quite heavily off the Christmas bird count. So many of you have probably participated in the bird counts. They're a 15-mile diameter circle, and you break out in groups and try to cover the areas as best you can. So that's for birds in the winter time, and that seems like a pretty big area to cover. So you can imagine in the summer trying to count all the butterflies in such a big area. So maybe they should have gone for a smaller circle, but they didn't. So the Xerces Society, they ran them for a number of years. They started them, but then it got transferred over to the North American Butterfly Association, NABA. And this was one of their annual reports where they actually used my photograph on the cover, which is a very pregnant cross-line skipper. But they compile the results of all of the counts in North America that are being done. In fact, some of them are even done in Mexico. There's about 450 counts done across North America. In Southern Ontario, we have about 30. In fact, in 2019 is when we had the most counts. We had 33 circles in mostly Southern Ontario. There's a couple in the northwest part of the province as well. And each of those are all the same area, but the amount of coverage varies from one area to the other, depending on how many participants come out. Some of them are only done by 1 or 2 people, but most of them we try to get as many parties as we can to cover those areas. Now in 2000, of course, the last 2 years with COVID, the number of counts, about a third of them were not being run. So we were only down to about 20 something counts for the last 2 years. Hopefully a lot of them will come back again and we'll have more counts. This is a list of all of the counts which were done in Ontario in 2019 when we had the highest number of counts. and just list all the species, the compilers, and the participants. Now, one thing you might notice from here is look at Halliburton Highlands and the number of butterflies they have. Over 36,000 butterflies. That's more than 10 times the amount of the next nearest count. And I will tell you a little bit more about that, how they got so many butterflies later. But anyway, they break up into areas, and of course you cannot possibly count all the butterflies in such a big areas. The idea is just to go out, try to cover a representation of different areas, but keep track of the time that you're out there. Doing counts is quite heavily weather dependent. Butterflies, they are sun-loving organisms. If you get a rainy day, you might as well stay home because you're not going to see very many. Even if you get a cool, cloudy day that doesn't rain, it's only about 18 degrees and there's no sun, it's not going to be very representative. You'll find some butterflies flying around, but it really will not give you a very good representation of the butterflies that are out there. So you might as well can it even if it's under those conditions, because really we want to get a sense of the butterflies that are out there. And so with good conditions, sunshine, calm weather, warm, those are the ideal conditions to have those butterfly counts. Now, when do we have the butterfly counts? Many of our species in Ontario, they're single brooded, which means they only have one life cycle a year, and many of them are on the wing for maybe 3 weeks of the year. So pretty narrow time window. So we like to try to schedule the counts at the very best time to maximize the species. Some, like the Arctic skipper, they're pretty early and they're mostly done by the time the counts are happening. The hair streaks come out later. You kind of want to try to maximize the time when the hair streaks are out. And so you really have to try to figure out the best time. We have some species which are really early, like the elfins. They're out mostly in May. The Leonard skipper is kind of the exception to the other skippers. They're out in August and September. So very few of the counts ever record these species just because they're at the far end. So really the best time of year is from the middle of June to late July. Probably about the 10th of July is the absolute peak when you get the most species on the wing. So that's when we try to schedule our counts, and many of them run on the same weekend every year. And it's fun to get out there at that time, and it becomes kind of an annual event. Now, of course, with every year, the weather is a little bit different. Spring comes late some years, comes earlier other years. And so that's can affect how the butterflies are, because they have to deal with the winter. They're hibernating in one way or another. And if you get a late spring, you might get a real delay in the count. And when you have your count, you'll be missing some of the species. Or if it's an early spring, you could have the opposite issue. I just use the red-winged blackbird because it's my harbinger of spring. And when you get the start of the very first warm days in March is when you start to see them. But the butterflies, they have to deal with winter in one way or another. So some, like this is the caterpillar of a Baltimore butterfly that I showed you earlier, and it feeds on turtlehead, and the caterpillar, it hibernates when it's half grown. And so when the weather warms up in the spring, it comes out of hibernation and it looks for plants, for the leaves that are out there. So if it's an early spring, it's going to emerge from hibernation earlier, and then it will pupate earlier and come out as a butterfly earlier than if you get a late spring. Fairly obvious. There you can see the pupa of very distinctive caterpillar, pupa, and butterfly. Now, different butterflies use different ways of surviving the winter. The hair streaks, for example, they lay their eggs in the midsummer and they will overwinter as an egg. And they hatch timed perfectly for when trees like cherry or oaks, which have got hard leaves, when they first emerge, they're very soft. And so the caterpillars take advantage of that. And then they pupate and then they emerge in early July. Then we have other butterflies like tiger swallowtails. They overwinter as a pupa. So again, those warm days in spring will determine how fast the metamorphosis happens within the pupa for them to emerge. So having counts, you want to get as many people as you can. especially people that know their butterflies. It's also a good opportunity for new people to learn butterflies, but I always like to try and pair experts with new people so that maybe the newbies will become experts over the years and they can lead their own groups. Of course, there are challenges. We have a lot of butterflies that are pretty distinctive, white admirals and tiger swallowtails and monarchs. But then there's other ones that are more of a challenge, like the skippers. And a third of all of our butterflies are skippers, where these little orange guys with various patterns. And not only are they small, but they're also mostly really fast. And so being able to identify them, you have to watch them, see where they land. And incidentally, you see, you always think of going out with a butterfly net, but when you're doing a butterfly count, what's far more useful than a butterfly net are binoculars. So watch where the butterflies land. You don't have to catch most of them. It's a few difficult ones that it is worth catching, but by and large, you want to see where they land, get them in the binoculars and ID them that way. And then there's estimating or counting the numbers of butterflies. Now this picture you see here, this was taken on that Halliburton count that I mentioned. And all those little orange flecks that you see there are European skippers. So on that count, the vast majority of those 36,000 butterflies were European skippers. And they were just so abundant in some fields, like every step you took, 100 skippers fly up. Now, how do you estimate numbers like that? It's a real challenge. Obviously, our count wasn't totally accurate, but it was a pretty good estimate in what we saw that day. So a bit of an art to doing that, a bit of practice. To have a good count, really want to hit a variety of habitats. I mentioned butterflies, they like sunny conditions, but they also, some of them are in the semi-shade, or if you get gaps in the forest, if you look at a shot like this, you get meadow marsh. Typically the moister areas have more butterflies, but some of the species will be where it's high and dry, different plants. Flowers are always a really important thing for attracting butterflies. So when we're on a count, we're looking for patches of milkweed or bergamot or other things that are in flower. And so that we want to get the numbers, we also want to get all of the species. So knowing the habitats is really useful to be able to maximize that number. People that are out often, they get to know their areas and they know where to hit. So how many butterflies can you get on a butterfly count? How many species? Well, the Sunderland Count, which is my northern count, it has the record for the most number of species in Ontario, 62 species, which we had in 2014. Now in 2021, last year, Mannion Corners near Ottawa, they also reached 62. So they tied the record. And I think the only other count that ever reached 60 was Halliburton. So some of the counts are in the high 50s, and that is pretty impressive because even across North America, there's not that many counts that get over 50 species, even in the south. And so the numbers that you get are quite astounding. So here is the Sunderland Count. I divided the native species from the total numbers because, as I mentioned, the European skipper can kind of overwhelm the numbers, as you can see in a couple of years there, 2003, 2008, far more European skippers than anything else. And so we're really more interested in the native ones because those are the ones that need our protection. We know all about invasive species. Well, we have a couple of butterflies too on that. And here's the European skipper. They can so overwhelm, but they're only out for a short time. So many years we don't actually hit the peak. There's maybe 1 week when they really are super abundant, and they're around for maybe 4 or 5 weeks in total. Now, another really important thing is keeping track of our effort. How many hours are we out in the field? Because that's actually a better way of comparing numbers from one year to another than just the total number, because it depends how many people you have out there. The more you have, obviously, you're going to have higher numbers. But by keeping track of hours, that way, even a count that's only out for 10 hours, they could compare with a count that's out, has 100 hours. And so this shows you the range of butterflies per hour. by field effort. And these are native ones, so we're not including the European skippers and the cabbages, but you can see some years we've had up to over 100, 110 species, 110 individuals per hour. Other years, like in 2009, only about 15 butterflies per hour. So that, keeping track of that effort and recording everything, when you are in the field, you kind of have to do it as you're going along. If you go out for half an hour and try to remember what you saw, well, you're going to forget some of the things. So this is looking at all of the butterfly counts in Ontario, really for all of the years. You can see the relative percentages of the butterflies. And so you can see those two non-native ones, particularly the European skipper and the cabbage white, they really do overwhelm the results. And then in the top 10, you can see some of the other ones. And once you get to the bottom of those 10, the other species make up a pretty small percentage of the total. And some counts, they have particularly high numbers of certain species. In our Sunderland count, we had 875 eyed browns one year, which was the all-time North American high. And most years, Sunderland does have the highest count of eyed browns. Just like petroglyphs, they have a huge, there you get thousands of dun skippers, and almost every year they have the highest North American count for those. But the butterflies, the population from one year to another, it can change very dramatically. Eastern-tailed blue, as an example, little blue butterfly with its tiny little hair on the end of its tail. On the Sunderland count, prior to 2013, they averaged 12 per year. And then 2013, they were just all over the place. We found them in places they never did before. And after that, we've actually had higher numbers, but it really fluctuates a lot. 2020, we had no European or no Eastern tail blues. Last year, we had 160. So, and many of the species, they do this kind of thing. You think they're going to be abundant all the time, and they vary from one year to another. Monarch is certainly a case in point. It's a really nice butterfly to monitor through because it's so distinctive that almost everybody counts it. So the numbers of individuals per hour, they're pretty accurate for something like a monarch. For a lot of the skippers, they're not very accurate because some of the counters, they're missing them, and it's really the experts that are finding them. But for the really big distinctive butterflies, the counts, the comparative counts are very, very useful. And so here you can see how much the monarchs have varied from one year to another. So last year was pretty good. 2021, you can see we're up over 5 monarchs per hour. But some of the years in like 2013, hardly any monarchs at all. And so that gives an indication of how they, doesn't always translate to how they go in Mexico, because they're coming from all over Eastern North America, but they're doing pretty well in Ontario some years. So here's a trivia question for you. How many generations a year does a monarch have? What do you think?
Shall we get people to bang some answers into the chat?
Yeah, when I first set up this one, we actually had a poll, which we don't have set up there now. But I mean, if you only have 4 choices, so I might as well give it to you. It's 4 to 5 generations per year. So pretty amazing to think of how these butterflies are able to find their way where they're like 4 or 5 generations removed. Anyway, lots of interesting trivia about monarchs. Red Admiral, it's another butterfly that is a migrant, not as well known for its migration because it winters in the southern states over quite a large area. It doesn't concentrate like the monarchs, but they all leave Ontario in the fall, and they're very variable from one year to another. One year they're just all over the place. Another year there's hardly any. So here's 3 species, just showing a comparison how their populations can vary from one year to another. The monarch, the red admiral, you see there's some years when we have over 5 per hour and others when you have virtually none at all. Whereas the white admiral, by contrast, it's more steady. We have more or less the same numbers every year. You do have lower years and higher years, but they do not fluctuate. They're not migratory either. So generally the non-migrants don't fluctuate quite as much as the migrants. But speaking of white admirals, one interesting trend we found with the butterfly counts. Now, the white admiral, the species, there's two forms of it. There's the southern form, which is really more of a Carolinian form, the red spotted purple, and then the white admiral, which is found through most of Ontario, going way up into northern Ontario. Now, in Durham, we have both forms, but the white admiral is far more numerous. And in fact, we have found very consistently about 10% of our admirals are red spotted purples, and the rest are white admirals. If you get a little bit further south, if you get into Hamilton, it gets more like 50-50. If you get into Niagara, it's more like 90% red spotted purples. And if you get further south, you get no white admirals at all. And I don't know, in your area, how common are red spotted purples? Do you get them, or you're further north? Hardly at all. So maybe you only get 1% up there.
James, I don't know whether you want to answer that. We don't get as many red spotted purple down here, but we talked about the Packard Tract where we went to see Kirtland warblers. And I did have a red spotted purple down there that was flying around with white admirals. But maybe you can answer a question on the fly here, because when I looked at my photographs of that white spotted purple and put it on iNaturalist, there was just a little bit of white where
Yes.
so that I don't know if you can't really call it a hybrid when they're both the same species, but
yeah.
It
But they are, they are very distinctive subspecies that are really recognizable. And you're absolutely right. Often the ones in this integrate area, you do get the odd hybrid. We get most of the ones are pure red spotted purples, but we do get some hybrids in Durham as well. And that sounds like exactly what you have. Tiger swallowtail. Now, we've with some of the research going on the genetics and on taxonomy, there are changes that are happening across all species. You know how things have happened with birds, how species have been moved between families, and how research has determined that what we used to think were closely related are not necessarily related. Tiger swallowtails, we were first, were all considered one species, but then they've been divided into the eastern tiger, which is more of a Carolinian one, and then the Canadian tiger, which is a more northern one, the Canadian being single brooded and the eastern being double or sometimes even triple brooded. But it's even more complicated than that, because we have the differences between the Canadian and the eastern are pretty subtle. There are some differences in where the blue is and the amount of how wide this black band is over here. And we thought we have the Canadians early in the season, and then in the midsummer, we were getting ones that we first thought were eastern tigers, but more recent research is indicating that they're a midsummer tiger that's actually has two broods, and it's sort of an intergrade between the Canadian and the eastern. And some are thinking maybe it's a third species, or maybe they're all really just one species. So very complicated sometimes. Another one that's a bit of a challenge for us are these crescents. We have, one time they were all considered pearl crescents, but then the more northern ones are distinct, but they vary so much. Like, for example, a real good northern crescent, the males have a real break in this line over here. Whereas if you see the pearl crescent, they have a continuous line, but sometimes this line is very thin, and sometimes there's just a little tiny break in there, and sometimes it's a really big break in there. And so we know that the counts of these species are not totally accurate because of the difficulty in trying to distinguish them. But the pearl is a more southern one that is a Carolinian. I mean, it does range. We get both of them in this area, but we get far more northerns than pearls. And if you get a little bit further north, you don't get any of the pearls. So having the experts getting out there, there's specialized habitats that we want to look for. And one of the ones are these little sedge marshes, where we get very specific species like the mulberry wing and the Dion skipper. And it's really, really finding those areas and hunting them out, because especially with some of the invasive plants, these little sedge marshes are disappearing. And one of the really interesting things that I found with butterfly counts, I know I said the count circle is really huge, too huge to do much of an accurate count. But one of the good things about having a big circle is you get, especially when you have multiple parties, you get people out there, you get all these eyes on the ground, and they find things. They find new habitats, and sometimes they find new species. This is an Atlantis fritillary. It was found by Rayfield Pye two years ago on our, it was a new record for Durham. We had never had an Atlantis fritillary in Durham. There are more northern species. And by the same token, a few years earlier than that, I was out in one of these sedge marshes and I netted this little fella, which is called a black dash, a Carolinian species, had never been recorded in Durham prior to that. But like some of the butterflies, it's in the process of expanding its range. So this is a shot of the map from the Butterfly Atlas. And if you look at most of these yellow squares here, these all came from our butterfly count records, where people were out there scouring the sedge marshes and finding the black dashes. And you can see more recently, they've turned up not too far from where you are in Simcoe County, and also here in Kawartha Lake. So typically they were, if you see the red squares, that were these are the older records of where the black dash were, and they are pushing up north as perhaps in response to climate change, because where there is a definite trend of several species doing that. Here are two other examples, Delaware Skipper and Dion Skipper, both southern species that have been expanding their range north. And in fact, I participate on the Halliburton count, and I found the first records of both of these species on Halliburton counts that were new for Halliburton County. And after a few years, like 1 year, the 5 or 6 years later, Halliburton had the highest count of Delaware skippers in Ontario. So it's amazing how first not even being in Halliburton, in a course of 6 or 7 years, they've become very abundant. So butterflies, they have that ability to show up. Giant swallowtail is another species that has been expanding its range. Now it has a food plant called the prickly ash, which is pretty rare in Durham. They've been showing up in Durham, but there's not many places where the food plant is available. Eastern Ontario, they've really expanded in that area where prickly ash is around. I don't know if you have this plant in your area, the prickly ash, or whether giant swallowtails have been falling up there. It has a limit in how far it's going to go because it's not going to be able to colonize north of that. And that's what the caterpillar looks like. I had them in my yard because I've planted prickly ash and hop tree, which are their food plants, and they have every late summer they show up in my yard, and we never used to have them in Durham at all. A few of the counts have some real specialties, some of the real rare ones. This is a mottled dusky wing. It's an endangered species in Ontario and Canada. It feeds only on New Jersey tea, which is not a very common plant. The Rice Lake Plains has a really good population of them, and they even try to time their count so they can get a good number of mottled dusky wings. They're the only count that ever gets them. There's another little skipper called a dusted skipper down in Pinery area. They're the only place that ever gets dusted skippers in Ontario. So there's a few real little specialties like that. And then we get these vagrants. Now they're more frequent in extreme southwestern Ontario, but occasionally these have all showed up on counts before. Cloudless sulfur is really, I mean, pipe vines, all of these are really from the southern US that very occasionally shows up in southern Ontario. But kind of like birds, if you've been to Point Pelee, you know how many interesting rare birds show up there. Well, there's also a lot of interesting butterflies that show up there too, for the same reason. They can fly, winds will carry them up there. Another trivia question for you. How many butterfly species do you think occur in Ontario? Quite a few, somewhere between 100 and 160. Well, I'll spare you the agony. 140 regular species and about 25 vagrants. Now the 140, that sounds like a lot. It is a lot. And it does include a few species that are found in the Hudson Bay lowlands. And there are a number of boreal species that we don't get in southern Ontario, but the majority of them we do get in the southern part of the province. So pretty good diversity. Now, I just highlight 2012, which it's now 10 years ago. but it was the most amazing year for butterflies that we have ever seen in Southern Ontario. And it started out, if you remember 2012 in March, it was so unbelievably warm. If you look at this map, it shows the US, where some of these areas were like 15 degrees. Now that's Fahrenheit, mind you, but 15 degrees above normal. And you can see in Southern Ontario, I remember that March. It was the only year that I ever did my frog surveys in March, because normally they come out at the very, very end of March. That year they came out early to mid-March. All these plants started blooming, butterflies started appearing far earlier than normal. And then we had in May this phenomenal movement of red admirals. Like they were just, I remember I had one time I drove from Toronto to London, and there were like red admirals just crossing the 401 the whole way as I'm going along. And what happened is in the Midwest, they had this severe drought that was pushing, I think was pushing butterflies beyond their range. And that's why I think we were having such big numbers of things that we almost never see, like the dainty sulfur, very, very rare butterfly in Ontario, occasionally shows up at Point Pelee. But in 2012, they were establishing colonies in southwestern Ontario at several places. And so you could go and you could see them anytime. Of course, they died out and they have not reappeared. We've never seen them again since. And then the buckeye was a real telltale, this beautiful, spectacular butterfly. Does occur in extreme southwestern Ontario every year, but getting much beyond that, they're much more irregular. But look at these graphs here. So the number of counts, and almost every count was getting buckeyes in 2012, almost all of them, because there were only about 25 counts that year. And most years, like last year, there were none. None of the counts had buckeyes. Usually some of the ones like Pelee Island or so, they get it, but actually they didn't do a count last year, so that. But also look at the numbers of the counts, the numbers per hour. So even most years when they get them, it's still, the numbers are so low, but up to an average of one buckeye per hour across all the counts. So that's pretty amazing. And since then, hardly any. Now, one of the recent ones that we saw last year was the Compton's tortoiseshell, which is kind of a more northern butterfly, pretty irregular in this area, but they've just really showed up, and more than half of all the counts were getting Compton's tortoiseshells last year, highest numbers we'd ever seen. What are they going to be like this year? There were quite a few around in the spring. I haven't seen too many recently, so I don't anticipate we'll have such high numbers again this year. And then this is a new one. It's the European common blue. As its name suggests, it's not native. It's from Europe. They started, somehow the population started in Quebec, and it's been moving. Now, the only butterfly count in North America that has recorded the species so far is Toronto. And the first year, 2 years ago, they had 6. And last year they had 120. And so I think we're going to see this butterfly appearing on more and more of the counts. Is it going to be a problem like the European skipper? We don't know. Or is it going to blend in? It feeds mostly on bird's foot trefoil, which is a non-native plant. So maybe it'll be okay. Beautiful butterfly anyway. Tell you a little bit about habitats. We did mention about the sunny habitats that they like. Historically, a lot of these butterflies must have been pretty scarce, because when most of Southern Ontario was forested, there really wasn't a lot of habitat. You go through a deciduous forest and you'll hardly ever see any butterflies. And so with the clearing of the land, the starting of agriculture, they opened up this new habitat and a lot of butterflies moved in. And so, of course, farms, graze cattle were put on the farm, and but then some fields are left fallow, so butterflies have moved in. Now, generally, those kind of fields, they have a few species in abundance, not a great variety. But a lot of disturbance, human-caused disturbance, actually benefits butterflies. You get a gravel pit, for example, where you often have a range of habitats, low wet areas and high and dry areas. It's pretty good places for butterflies. This is kind of an ideal situation here, which is along a pipeline where we got a meadow marsh in the bottom going up to drier meadow on the higher slopes, edge of the forest. So some really nice habitats. Marshes too. Cattails and canary grass are not very productive, but sedge marshes or meadow marshes where you get Joe Pye weed and goldenrods and bone sets, those are great places for butterflies. But sometimes these habitats are ephemeral. Like I mentioned the rail trail where we had all those Baltimores. When I started the count in Sunderland, the first couple of years, there were so many butterflies on the rail trail. It was amazing. Huge numbers of mustard whites. But then over time, it started to change. Well, here's Columbine dusky wing, which is quite an uncommon butterfly in Durham. The first couple of years, we had dozens of them along the rail trail. But since then, we've had hardly any. And so what's happened over time, succession has taken place. At first, the railway was fairly recently abandoned, quite open on the side, but the shrubs start growing in, the alders and the willows, and eventually it's not as productive. So it does need some kind of, unless you get like a meadow marsh where it's the flooding regime keeps open conditions, or if you have really dry rock barrens or prairies, a lot of butterfly habitats are kind of dependent on human disturbance and abandonment. But we kind of need abandonment because we got lots of disturbance happening, but not so much abandonment anymore. And butterflies, because they're flying insects, they can really cover ground and they have the ability to colonize suitable habitat in a very short time. Another trend that we've been seeing, which is probably no surprise to anybody, is habitat loss. So here's a part of the Sunderland Count circle that I cover. Nice looking habitat here. We've got some meadow marsh there, some hedgerows, forest edge, pretty good. This was a pretty good butterfly habitat. But what happened? A couple of years later, this is what it looked like. The farmer came in, cut down all the hedgerows, put tile drainage in the meadow marsh, and now it's just a desert as far as butterflies are concerned. And we're seeing this kind of trend more and more all around, no surprise. You get along hedgerows, you do get a few things maybe on the very edge, but generally not very productive habitats. And the other big issue that's happening with habitat, of course, and another no surprise, are invasive species. We've seen some really great productive areas get overtaken with dog strangling vine and garlic mustard. And so that is a real concern in a lot of areas. You go in the Rouge and there's so much habitat loss. But anyway, it really is a great experience getting people out on these butterfly counts from several different views. One is collecting the data, but also just the camaraderie, the learning experience. It's great when we get young people out to the counts that some of them get really turned on to butterflies, getting out with the experts, and you don't have to be young just to new. You can pick it up at any time. There's kind of a nice convenient number of species, enough species to keep you really interested, but not so overwhelming. And then it's been contributing to a lot of data. People through the Butterfly Atlas, there was eButterfly. Now a lot of people are submitting their records into iNaturalist, and that way we've been able to get a pretty good idea of the distribution across the province. And I found it really like a learning experience, just getting to learn habitats in our own areas, having a better handle on the species, where they're found, what their habits are. And then being able to monitor certain species like the Monarch, which is one of our kind of iconic species that has been fluctuating and is a real conservation concern. So all in all, Ontario has been doing a really great job on counts, better counts than almost any other jurisdiction in North America. And I think part of it is the big reason for that. The Toronto Entomologists Association, they list all the counts on the website, and people that are really into butterflies, they've kind of got in a habit. Some people like to do 4 or 5 counts a year, and they look on the website, what are the counts close to me? And then they'll call the compiler. Because so many of the counts across North America, there are maybe 2 people, 3 people go out for half a day and they find a dozen species, 20 species, whereas many of our counts are in the 50+ species range. We get a dozen or more people out, half a dozen parties. So really, really good coverage. So what's it like across the rest of Canada? Well, pretty poor. This year, there was only, in 2021, there was only one butterfly count west of the Ontario border, and that was in Saskatchewan. 1999, Alberta had more counts than any other jurisdiction in North America, more than any other US states, more than California. And what happened since then? I don't know. Now there's none. British Columbia, great butterfly habitat with all that dry country, never had a butterfly count, at least none that have been submitted to NABA. And the Maritimes, no better. So it really is kind of an Ontario institution. They are widespread across the US, like they've been much more promoted. And so they're almost every state has at least one butterfly count. I'll give you the last trivia question of the night. You probably know there's more moths than butterflies, but how many more moths than butterflies? You think it's 5, 10, 20, or 50 times? I'll spare you the results. 20 times, approximately 20 times more moths. So roughly about 3,000 species of moths in Ontario. So way more difficult to get to learn the moths. And the other thing with moths is you need a light really to attract them, because most of them are out at night, so difficult to see. But butterflies and moths, they are quite closely related. They are in the same order, Lepidoptera. They have very similar structures. Moths tend to have different antenna shape. They tend to be furrier, but they are quite closely related. I'm also very interested in moths. I do have a moth program that I also do. And a lot more people are getting into moths because they are very interesting in their own right. So that gives you a little bit of introduction into Ontario butterfly counts, what they are, what we've learned. They're been able to contribute. They're also a lot of fun to get out, come out every year, and there's discoveries to be made. You never know what might turn up this year. This is an American snout, beautiful butterfly. A couple of years ago, there was quite a movement of them, and they showed up on several of the counts. So you just never know. So if you get a chance, I know some of you are involved in the Owenda count. That's great. That one's been going on for a few years. There's also, I know there was the Aurelia count. There's a count on Carden. So there's a couple of counts not too far from where you are. If you check that TEA website, you'll be able to get involved with them. So there you have it, Ontario butterfly counts. I guess at this point, I'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, thanks very much, James. And why don't you just, before we get into questions, just stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
So a couple of things that popped up on the chat. Let's deal with them first. From Vicky and Bill. Now, I'm not sure if I got the right term, but it says, when did the banded purple become the white admiral? They are the same family as red spotted purple. Not red.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Well, the banded purple is just another name for the white admiral. I know some people use the term banded purple. Perhaps it would be less confusing because you got the red spotted purple and the banded purple, but the names I've always used that were in the field guides was the white admiral. And so there was no specific. Now I think on iNaturalist, they call it red spotted admiral, which because it's species, it doesn't distinguish the subspecies, so it comes in.
Sometimes there's naming, I mean, there's some butterflies that are worldwide and some that are just North American, and sometimes they're trying to get names to coincide with what they have in Europe, but that doesn't always seem to happen with butterflies. But
yeah, there's not too many that are worldwide. Like the painted lady is one that is very distant, and the monarch actually does occur wider than North America, but they are the exception. Well, unless you get some of the non-native ones like cabbage white and European, but otherwise there's actually not too many butterflies that would happen.
I know our European skipper in Europe, they don't call it that. They call it.
No, that's right. Exactly. Yeah. And and even the new one, the European common blue is just called common blue.
Mm-hmm. From Elizabeth, Elizabeth asks, how do you cope with ticks on your count? They have a lot of ticks and Rito lakes.
Yeah,
maybe in general, if you've got some advice about how to equip yourself to go on a butterfly count.
Yeah, and ticks, when we started the butterfly counts, we never worried about ticks. Well, I'm sure any naturalist that's been around for a long time recall not too many years ago when it was just not a concern, but now it is a concern. One of the things that, I mean, if of course, when it's hot, well, you never wear shorts. When I would never wear shorts in a butterfly count anyway, because I end up in raspberries. But what I do in the field often is I put rain pants over my pants. And then I'll have, if I have rubber boots on, and then just the rain pants going over the rubber boots. So that pretty much protects you from ticks from the waist down. You can pick up ticks higher than that because they will get into the shrubbery. Another thing I do is tuck my socks in and then spray insect repellent just around the lower part of my legs. So that seems to help quite a bit. But yes, I still pick up the odd tick here and there. And I've even, not very long ago, I actually had a deer tick embedded in my arm. I had to go to and then when I was trying to pull it out with tweezers, it broke. So I had to go to the clinic to get it surgically removed.
I wonder, do we have to, if you are using a net, I know, do you have to worry about getting ticks in your net and then reaching in there for butterflies? Or?
I've never had tick in my net, to tell you the truth. So ticks are pretty slow moving things. I mean, they are very slow. So if you did get one in the net and you saw it, you could avoid it. Just fling it off. But
I think sometimes you have to be a little concerned about swishing your net through poison ivy and then handling the net.
Oh yeah, and then the other thing is brambles. Like if you pull your net through blackberries, you'll just tear it to shreds. So you have to, and then sometimes when the brambles have nice white flowers on it, there are lots of butterflies that come to it. So you have to watch it.
So remember, if anybody has any questions that they want to ask in person, I think down at the bottom of your screen or somewhere, you might see, I think it's on my screen, it comes under reactions. You can raise your hand there and I'll be sure not, or you can just speak up. But if you have any other questions, put them into the chat and we'll get to them. Nancy Ironside, she remembers running around a field behind Oshawa. Behind Oshawa where? Nancy, are you there? She's asking, was that the first count that you did?
Yeah, the first count that I organized was the Oshawa count. And I know Nancy used to have a count near her she had a little cabin near, where was it? Matchadash Bay, I think, or Matchadash Lake. I know she was, and I think I helped her out once on that one, but Oshawa was the first one, but the very first count I've been on was Long Point in 1992.
I have a couple of questions myself. Jane, what you say, again, just to remind people, when we're done with the questions, we have a few little extra things to get to, so don't leave right away. We have a couple of little extra treats for you. And just to remind everyone again that we do have a local butterfly count coming up at Awenda Provincial Park on July 10th, I believe, Saturday, July 10th. Is that the right date? And I'll give you the email for Nick at Awenda Park if you want to volunteer later. But I'm wondering, the nice thing about butterfly counts, unlike bird counts, you don't have to get out there at 6 o'clock in the morning because the butterflies don't get up that early either. So this is perfect for you, Bob and Susan Codd, butterfly counts. They really don't start till about 10 a.m. or so, and they only like sunny days, so which we like. But I wonder, what do the butterflies do if they get 4 or 5 days of rain? Just hunker down? Are they able to feed?
Yeah, they're pretty dormant, so they'll be in the grass, or they'll be under the shrubs. And I know I've heard of some of my colleagues that still try to run butterfly counts even when it rains, and they'll try and kick things up, but usually the numbers are so low. But one of the things, when the weather is cool, the butterflies, they live longer. So if they're not moving much for a couple of days, they don't wear out. When the hotter the weather is, that makes them very active, but they also wear themselves out, and they seem to really burn out in a very short time. If you get like a week of 30 plus weather, it really does a number on the butterfly population.
And we talked a little bit about the European skippers and how dominant they can be in counts. Do we know exactly why they prosper so much more than some of our native species?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've never seen any information that was even suggesting how much harm they do with, if they are doing much harm, except that sometimes when you get those really huge numbers, you'll see the males will even try to copulate with the native skippers, with the odd native, and the native skippers are so few and far between that they may have a hard time finding each other. I think that they're feeding on, like most of the skippers feed on grasses. So they're feeding on non-native grasses, probably like Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome, and you know, the native skippers are probably feeding on a lot of the non-native grasses as well. It's not, I haven't really found whether the native skippers were always in kind of the densities they are. They were never abundant. I don't imagine they were ever anywhere near as abundant as European skippers are. And they seem to persist still with where there are places where there are a lot of European skippers. So the European skippers are not completely displacing them, but they must be having some impact. But I haven't really seen how much impact that is.
And do we think the European skipper numbers are continuing to grow, or are they sort of leveled off, or?
Well, I think they've leveled off. In the very first place that European skippers showed up was near London, Ontario, in the late 1800s, and they've spread from there right across the continent. Like they're right across Canada now and well into the US, but all started in London, Ontario.
And I think I read somewhere that they arrived in a shipment or something, or?
Yeah, well, they brought in a lot of, they brought in a lot of hay crops, and like they brought in forage grasses and forage plants like clovers, yellow clover, or not yet. Well, yeah, hop clover and red clover and white clover. None of those are native. Birdfoot trefoil.
Yeah.
And so it probably came in with the seed, maybe just the eggs in among the seed. It's so easy to transport insects, as you know.
I have a question that segues kind of nicely from Ken's. Like, are there any European or invasive species that are putting the native species at risk?
Of butterflies?
Yeah.
Well, we only had two, now three non-native butterflies. So that's the European skipper, the cabbage white, which is mostly, they feed on a whole pile of mustard. So they go in your garden and they'll feed on broccoli and cabbage, but they also will feed on a lot of wild mustards, even things like toothwort, but mostly weedy things like wintercress. And there's a lot of different members of the mustard family that they feed on. So how much are they competing with? Apparently the checkered white used to be more numerous, and it's pretty much disappeared from southern Ontario since the cabbage. So that's one species that was affected by it. There's the West Virginia white is very specific to toothwort, which is in the mustard family. It's more in the forest. Cabbage white doesn't go in the forest a whole lot, so I don't imagine it's really impacting the West Virginia white too much. This European common blue, it remains to be seen whether it's going to outcompete our native blues. Like we have silvery blues. And the silvery blues feed on cow vetch and different members of the pea family. This one feeds apparently mostly on bird's foot trefoil, which I don't think that silvery blue is feeding on. So maybe it's going to be kind of an equilibrium. Some of the invasive species of plants are not particularly problematic. There's a few that are really bad and other ones that sort of develop into an equilibrium. I mean, everything has to develop into an equilibrium sooner or later, but how much damage does it do before that happens? That's the question.
Bob has a question.
Well, it's got to do with the sponge moth outbreak that we had last year, and my question is specifically about the aerial spraying that advocates say that it only affects the gypsy moth, or sorry, the sponge moth. But I'd just like to hear your viewpoint on it, because I quite frankly don't believe it, but a lot of people
and neither should you.
There was a lot of these spray companies that were just insisting we can spray your property and it won't affect any butterflies or any.
Yeah,
anything other than the gypsy moth.
Like spraying frag mice. Okay.
yeah, the BT will affect any Lepidoptera in the larval stage. So apparently it won't affect the adults. So they're correct in saying it won't affect the butterflies. However, it will affect the immature butterflies, which are caterpillars.
Mhm.
So, because I guess they ingest it and it's bacteria that kills them. So yes, it does affect. So there is a real concern of anything that's in the caterpillar phase, and there's going to be lots of other things that are in caterpillar phase while the gypsy moths are out there. So I would definitely say it's having an impact.
Fortunately, we seem to persuade most of the local authorities not to do mass spraying programs. And also, fortunately, it does seem like we've gone through the peak of the gypsy moth invasion. They don't seem to be nearly as prevalent this year at all.
Yeah, our trees here were wiped out last year, and this year I've seen exactly one caterpillar. So
Yeah, I've seen a few caterpillars. I had a couple of trees in my yard that were totally defoliated, and there were just so many egg masses. I was really expecting to have another bad year. One of the real controls for them are parasitic flies and wasps that lay their eggs on the caterpillars. But last year, so many of them made it into adulthood and laid eggs. I expected that this year we would. So, but maybe those parasites are going to town right now and getting the numbers back into check, hopefully, because you're right. I have not seen, it's still, well, yeah, and we're now well into June. So
right.
By this time last year, we were seeing pretty serious defoliation.
Just if people look at the chat, Kate Harris has thrown in a couple of things there, just some reminders. We talked about, invasive species, which they're trying to control at Tiny Marsh, and she's put down the dates where they're going to do more of the garlic mustard pulls. And she wants to thank a couple of our club members, Kathy Peltier and Gaia Seagram. I don't think Gaia's on the call tonight, but thank them in particular for all the hard work they've been putting in. And she also put a link there for a petition to the Government of Canada to protect the Simcoe Uplands recharge area for the Alliston Aquifer. And just a reminder that this petition is closing at the end of the month, June 30th. A lot of us have already signed it, but if anybody out there is not aware of this petition, the link is there, and the more signatures on that, the better, to protect the cleanest water in the world.
I've tried to sign that 3 times and it just won't let you do that.
No, just sign it once. And encourage 2 other people to sign it, then you're got it covered that way.
I just need more email addresses.
Yeah.
Is there a moth count?
No, there's the moth count would be just too hard to do because I've actually, what I have is I have a light trap for moths. And so it has a mercury vapor light, which is actually no longer, you can't even get anymore. So when they burn out, I'm in trouble. But it sits on a bucket and there's a funnel, and the moths that come in, they fly around the light, which, as you know, moths are attracted to light, and they will just go in there, and there's egg cartons in there. And in the morning, I just open it up and take all the moths out and photograph them and try to identify them that way. But moths, like the vast majority of it, if moths weren't attracted to lights, you would have no idea how many moths are out there, because many of them, they're way up high in the trees, and maybe you see the caterpillar once in a while, but it's just undoable because, and even the ones that do fly in the day, I think most of them are kind of hidden in the vegetation, and when you kick them up, like there's a little one called the forage looper and these toothed somber wings, like they look like butterflies, and and then there's the tenuta moths. They look kind of like black butterflies. So there's a few that you would see, but
Yeah,
no.
I find moths can be annoying. Like a butterfly, I try to photograph them. The butterfly will usually perch on top of the leaf. But most moths that fly in the day, they always seem to perch underneath the leaf, which makes
they are. And I know those toothed somber wings, they were pretty little moth, actually. But they are hard to photograph because when you try to get close to them, they fly up again, and they are not easy to photograph. Whereas usually skippers, I find, some of them are very aloof, but with patience, you see they land on a flower or so, and then usually if you really creep up slowly, you can get close to them. But you're right, some of those moths are challenging that way.
And I did notice on one of your graphs, the per hour count for the native species between 2013 and 2018 seemed to be almost zero, or there was a gap in the graph. Or am I mistaken about that?
Was that was for
The per
like,
hour.
yeah, but that was for like the red admirals and the monarchs, because in some years they were really low, like some years, you know, like we got no red admirals on our counts last year, or maybe one, and some years you could have a couple hundred. And so I think it was the graph that was showing the red admiral and the monarch and the white admiral, I think.
I think
Then,
so.
then it got really low. It did get really low in those intervening years. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the graph was showing the monarchs and the red admiral went way up and down, whereas the white admiral went kind of steady.
Right. And the migrants seem to be very volatile. Like the question mark is another one that's a migrant. Some years, lots of them, other years, virtually none. And because they, you know, I guess we don't know what happens, how many of them survive the winter. Maybe they have a really poor survival in the winter because they winter as adults. They don't winter as a pupa or as eggs. They winter as adults and then they fly back up again. And so there's all these different things happening. And you know, I mean, parasites are a big thing. I mean, we just talked about the sponge moth and how it's affected by, but it's the same with butterflies. There's parasitic wasps and flies and predators and climate, weather, wet spring, dry spring. There's all these things. We don't know what's affecting them, but the numbers just fluctuate. And especially when you get a boom year, you go, wow, how come are there so many now? Well, the other thing with butterflies and insects, they lay so many eggs that they have a tremendous power of reproduction. So when the conditions are really good, then they can really build up their numbers in a short time. Unlike, say, birds or mammals or reptiles that, you know, would take them years and years to build up the numbers if the conditions were suddenly ideal.
I get the feeling that we don't have as much information on butterflies as we do, say, birds. I mean, the bird count, Christmas bird count's been going for over 100 years.
Yeah.
I know people are tagging monarchs. Is there much science going on in the way, similar to MODIS tracking or tagging of other species? Or
Well, no, not of other species. And even with the tagging, I know the returns are extremely low. Like you think the returns of bird banding was low. Well, butterflies of the monarchs is far, far lower than that. They find the odd one, like when they have in Mexico with the big roosts, they find the odd one in there. But no, the thing is they're so short-lived, and the chance of finding them is, you know, the numbers can be so huge. So the chance of finding them, if you put little MODIS trackers on them, it would be pretty expensive for very low returns, I think. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there are a lot of things, but you know, we're getting more and more technology. I mean, this iNaturalist has been a real boon, because I found, like, just for the moths, for example, it was a real struggle to try to identify those moths, especially when you get those little ones. So I kind of didn't really bother with them for a number of years, but with iNaturalist, you can submit your photograph and it'll give you a pretty good idea of what it is. And it might not give you the correct ID a lot of the time, or a third of the time, but still it's getting you in the right direction. And then you can look up, it'll give you a few different options. So it's been quite amazing. So I think a lot more information is coming out now, because more and more people are submitting to iNaturalist. And so we're going to have way more information about distribution of a lot of these things that were very obscurely known, just a few experts. And you know, it was always collectors before. So before, anybody that was interested in insects 25 and more years ago, they were basically collectors. Whereas now collecting is not as necessary, and you know, there's sort of a social norm against really collecting, except for really good scientific reasons. But a lot of times you don't need to. There's good resources, and especially with cameras now, it's you can get all the details there.
Well, that's last chance for any last minute question. Oh, David has his hand up. David Cow. You have to unmute there, David. David, check your microphone.
There we go. How's that?
Yeah.
Got it.
Good. Okay. Can you comment on species that are actually puddlers and another group of species that I would call poopers. Okay,
Oh, yeah.
they're attracted to feces. So
Yeah, okay, well, they're sort of the same reason why they're going to the puddle. So it's not so much the water, it's the nutrients that are like the salts that are in there and certain compounds that they get out of it. So sometimes I know I've seen swallowtail or something, and they've got their proboscis in the wet mud, and there's like water shooting out of their rear end. So they're and the same with, they're getting nitrogen out of the feces. And yeah, so nitrogen is a big one, and sodium, those are what they're getting out of often the water in the puddles. But yeah, it's often a really good place to look for butterflies. And
Do you ever on your counts, James, perhaps place some dog species out there in an attempt to attract butterflies, or is that cheating?
no, I wouldn't call that cheating. What I've done, I spent a lot of time in Belize years ago, and what I did there is I was getting fruit. Now there you get a lot of butterflies that feed on fruit, like rotting fruit. So I would get mangoes and bananas and pineapples and let them get good and ripe, and then hang them. And actually there in the forest, a lot of butterflies are in the forest. So unlike here where there's almost nothing in the forest, in the tropics, there are a lot of butterflies in the forest, but it's amazing what you get on there. But I haven't really tried. It's not a bad idea. I usually just, when I find the feces, it's
Except you'd have
there.
to transport the feces there
Yeah,
somehow or
yeah.
other, but it could be awkward.
Yeah, the Carden Plain, which probably many of your members are familiar with, when you get those mud puddles on that road, like on Wiley Road, they can be really good for
Really good spot.
butterflies. Yeah, yeah.
Perhaps if we do a tiny marsh, we have one four-legged honorary member of the club, James, that comes along in most of our walks, and perhaps Piper can provide us with a bit of bait whenever we do our butterfly.
Yeah.
She doesn't poop on command, trust me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and,
that's okay. They are attracted to goose poop.
yeah, the
Plenty of that.
poo usually has to sit there for a little while to get just right the way the butterflies like it. So when it's really fresh, I don't know, maybe need to wait a day or two.
Well, I can bring you a sampler pack if you like, Ken.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Okay, well, I think if that's all the questions, thank you very much, James. Hopefully you've got everybody excited about joining a butterfly count, if not at Awenda, somewhere else. Again, you can go to that Toronto Entomological Association's website and see where all the butterfly counts are and when they are. But beautiful presentation, and butterflies are, they can be, I find, they're more cooperative than birds. Birds are jerks, and we just want to see them and they go flying off into the trees, and they don't let us even have a look. Whereas butterflies will usually sit there and at least let you have a look. They're good that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, my pleasure to be here, and always I like to stimulate interest, and yeah, if you have a chance, try to sign up on the count and learn about butterflies. And even if you're not on the count, you can see things in your own garden. If you've got some wildflowers, or go to the nearest feed. But we're really at prime time now, and over the next month, it's really the very best time of the year for butterflies. So
Good.
get
So
out there.
I'm gonna unpin James here, and then I'm gonna share my screen, because I thought to close off the meeting. Again, we have the count coming up in Awenda, and I have a little presentation of photos from last year's count that some of our members put together. So I'll just see if I can share my screen and we can take a look at that.
Here we go.
Everybody got that?
Yep.
Okay. So this was from last year's count, which of course was still during COVID, but we got a fair number of people out to Awenda to count butterflies. And of course, we did have a fair number of monarchs this year. There's a monarchs with a crescent, probably a northern crescent.
Yep.
This was a pair of monarchs mating, which I'm not sure if I can tell which one's the female and the male there, but they are mating. Here's the white admiral.
Beautiful.
And This is a white admiral along with some common wood nymphs. Northern crescents. They probably had, well, I'm not sure if we had a lot of dun skippers, but northern crescents might have been number 2 on the count last year. More northern crescents. Lots of other pollinators along with that northern crescent. And we're pretty sure this was a pearl crescent, though, that Mary had in her garden, as that little white mark on the underwing for making it a pearl crescent. Compton's tortoiseshell, we had a pretty good count of them last year. When we do catch them, sometimes we use these little plastic bags. We can put them in there and examine them, and it doesn't harm them, and then we release them. Fritillaries, great spangled fritillary. Another great spangled.
Yeah.
We had eastern commas. The comma is that little mark on the wing there. I don't think I have any, we think we had question marks. Question mark would have a little dot making it a question mark. But then we also got some gray commas, which are a little rarer in the area. A little different mark on the gray comma. That's the gray comma again. And I think one of the highlights in a wind every year are these little guys. They're very, very tiny. And we find them in what they call the Fairlane Bog, which is not a place you normally get to go unless you're on the butterfly count. And these are the bog coppers, tiny little butterfly that flies around Fairlane Bog. We did get some hair streaks. These were the banded hair streaks. And I think last year might have been the first year we ever got these, the coral hair streak on the count.
Beautiful.
The coral hair streak, we had to take a close look at that one, so we put it in the bag. Silver spotted skipper, one of the prettier skippers. And then we got the northern pearly eye, Appalachian brown, northern cloudy wing. We called this one a dun skipper, although Chris Evans wasn't sure that it might not be a northern broken dash, but pretty sure it was probably a dun skipper. But some of them are tricky. This one's definitely a dun skipper. We had some discussion about this one too. We thought it might be a summer azure, but a lot of people feel that we probably don't get the summer azure this far north. So it might have just been a spring azure. Cabbage white, mustard white. But then again, being naturalists, we can't just look at the butterflies. We need to look at other things. There are some day flying moths, like this beautiful great plume moth.
Yeah, plume moths.
And we get some dragonflies to look at, Canada darners. This is a widow skimmer. Other things show up when we count butterflies, the garter snakes, snapping turtles. And then there's the plants, which are very cooperative, always willing to pose for a photograph. This is rose campion. And in the Fairlane Bog, again, along with those little bog coppers, we get some nice orchids. This is the tuberous grass pink orchid.
Oh, wow.
Scarlet bee balm, wild bergamot, staghorn sumac, great mullein, common self-heal. You can tell some of them got bored of looking for butterflies, switched to flowers. Tick trefoil, blue-bead lily, red baneberry, white baneberry, partridge berry, bottle brush grass, aptly named. And again, in that Fairlane Bog, we get the pitcher plants, the purple pitcher plants.
Nice.
Yellow pond lily, white pond lily, tamaracks. This is a cute one that was in the Fairlane Bog, the British soldier lichen. And there's mushrooms around. It's not the prime time of year for mushrooms, but collared parachute, ghost pipes, orange moss agaric. And some people photos. This is the start of the day as we all get together to get our assignments, breaking off into different groups. There's Tim Tully telling people how we're going to go about things. There's MPFN member Paul Bell over by Kettle Lake ready with his net to catch a few butterflies. There's Ruth. There's the group over at Kettle Lake. Some scenery photos from Kettle Lake. There's one of the park staff taking a photo of something. I can't see what she's shooting. And I think this is over by Fairlane Bog. Yeah, this is in the bog. You need boots to go there most years. This is Chris Evans' team. I think they drove up to the west end of the park. And this is the team that did the Seneca Fen, which is up by Mary Rajapaski's place. And they got to go over to Mary's place for lunch in the middle of the day. And that closed it off with some lovely lilies in Mary's garden. So thanks to our photographers, it was Ken McDonald, Deepthi Rajapakse, Frida Baldwin, Claire Holden, Chris Evans, and Paul Bell. And we'll just close it off with this little slide that encourage you all to get out there and count some butterflies. It can be just as much fun as the Christmas bird count. It's a lot warmer. You don't have to deal with 20 below temperatures, and can be a lot of fun, and you can learn a lot. So the person to contact this year is one of the staff there, Nick Epelar at ontario.ca. And again, the count is coming up on July 10th. Sometimes, because it is weather dependent, if the weather doesn't cooperate that day, they might schedule a different date as well. But
I think it's the 10th, it's the 9th, the Saturday.
9th, July 9th, Saturday. I'll get the wrong day.
Yeah.
It's nice, yeah.
Yeah. But again, sometimes if the Saturday doesn't work, they might switch it to the Sunday. But get the message into Nick to sign up, and he'll keep in touch with you as to what the plans are. Okay, I think with that, I'll stop sharing my screen. And that's about it. Good night, everybody. I think this might be our last, I don't think we'll do any other Zoom meetings during the summer. And we are planning to do our first live meeting, COVID willing, in September. And we will be hosting what's called the joint meeting of all the Simcoe North Naturalist clubs. We were scheduled to do this in 2020, and things did not work out, as you know. So we're going to do it now in 2022. We'll be inviting all the naturalists from Barrie, Aurelia, Carden to join us. And we have everybody's favorite guest speaker, David Hawk. He's working on a presentation on the history of Y Marsh and Tiny Marsh. So that'll be the third Thursday in September at Y Marsh.
Just before you go there, Ken,
Yeah.
For those members who are really keen about butterfly and dragonfly counts, the Carden Alvar count will take place on July 23rd and 24th, and it will be headquartered at the Robert Bowles Nature Center. You can contact the center if you're interested. I don't know, did you receive a copy of the announcement, Ken?
Not yet.
Not yet. I'll send you one.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
And contact person there is June Crimmin.
That's always a great area to count butterflies and dragonflies, and they usually try to do the butterflies one day, dragonflies the other day, or vice versa.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, 23rd is butterflies, 24th is dragonflies. So
if the weather cooperates.
if the weather cooperates,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay. Good night. Thank you, James. That was a great presentation.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Have a good
Bye.
summer, everybody. See lots of great stuff.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.